send information, but also to receive information. There's a number of examples where people have been stuck on their roof during a hurricane or flooding event. They've sent out something on Facebook or Twitter, and public safety entities have used it actually to respond and to save their lives. So there's a two-way avenue for communication and public safety. Clearly, law enforcement has used information from social media to enhance public safety, especially as it relates to investigations or major public events where the public might be threatened. So again, understand the core concepts of communication, how communication is used. A lot of our discussion about the incident command system and the national incident management system is all about communication and how do we coordinate and communicate in order to effectively respond. And if you go back to week 12 and week 10, the focus was on recovery. And again, you read a couple of the chapters on recovery, the discipline and emergency management recovery. There was a video about the blackout in Puerto Rico, the blackout in Puerto Rico that lasted 7 or 9 months after Hurricane Maria. And again, it's important to note that there's a lot of focus on preparedness, what we do ahead of time, developing our emergency operation plan, mitigation. There's been increased focus on how do we increase our readiness for disasters, building seawalls and raising houses. And again, a lot of attention gets focused on response because again, that's the lights and sirens, and clearly that is the area where you're most directly trying to save lives. But it's important to note that recovery is probably the longest and most complex of the phases of emergency management. When you're talking about recovery, you look back at Hurricane Katrina that happened in 2005, there are still certain elements of recovery going on in Louisiana and New Orleans related to that disaster. And so when you look ahead to Puerto Rico, they're looking at least a decade of recovery given the amount of damage to schools and other critical infrastructure, their ports, clearly their homes and communities. And so when we have these massive disasters, we have to understand the complexities related to recovery. There are multiple agencies that are involved, not just FEMA, but it's also the Housing and Urban Development Agency. There's a Small Business Administration Agency, and billions of dollars are funneled to these local governments and entities through the support of Congress and the White House. And then there has to be project management to again reconstitute these areas, to rebuild the schools, to rebuild the homes, etc. There's a lot of administrative red tape and paperwork, and it takes a long time. But again, as we look ahead to more impactful and more frequent natural disasters, these are the things that we have to plan and consider. That recovery processes will be continue to be more complex. There have been efforts by the federal government to get rid of some of the red tape, but again, when you're talking about disasters of this scale, you can only imagine some of the complexities of dealing with an extended recovery period. Finally, again, I'm gonna stop here briefly after I go over week 9 and 8 because that's that is the second half of the semester after the midterm exam. But week 9 and week 8 we focus on the terrorist threat. We focus on response. Week 9 we focus specifically on the terrorist threats. And it's important to note the different types of terrorism and tactics that terrorism uses. We're looking at both international but also domestic. We have an increased rise of domestic terrorism in our country related to white nationalism that we've seen, it's important to note that we're looking at that as well as international terrorism from ISIS and Al Qaeda and the things that we experienced since 9/11. There was a video related to 15 years of terror that identified and documented all the various threats from terrorism that we faced. Clearly, in the last couple of weeks, we've seen terrorism as it relates to the church shooting in Sri Lanka, the mosque shooting, terrorist attack in Australia, and clearly a host of other incidents, including here in the United States. And so it tells us that this threat has not gone away, that it evolves. And again, as emergency managers, we have to continue to understand the complexities of the terrorist threat in order to plan against it and to mitigate them. So you should understand the techniques and tactics of terrorism, and again, understand what we can do to respond to that. Finally, in week 8, we talked about the discipline of emergency management, or the phase of response. And again, response get a lot of attention because it again is uniquely focused on saving lives. And when the bad thing has happened, whether it's a terrorist attack or a natural disaster, how can we respond in an integrated, focused fashion, leveraging the whole public safety community and all the resources you have? Because again, when you're dealing with these complex disasters like a major hurricane, high wind, flooding, water, tornadoes, your infrastructure is impacted, the electricity is down, hospitals are impacted. You still have folks getting sick, still have pregnant women who need to have their children. People are having heart attacks. How do you reconstitute a sense of normalcy despite all of the chaos that's going on? So response has to be integrated, has to be coordinated, and there was a couple examples of some failures, quite honestly, as it relates to the 2017 hurricane season. And part of your reading was the FEMA After Action report, where they documented some of their failures as it relates to that season. But that 2017 season, if you recall, was very busy for the emergency management community. You have 3 major historic disasters that impacted the continental United States as well as Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. And so Harvey, Maria, and Irma, very costly disasters, very devastating disasters, and everything did not go well. And sadly, that is something to recognize. And a disaster, everything is not going to go well and perfectly, but you have to adjust